Okay, this video is a book review. Here is the book Irish Americans by Dolan. It's a good book. I just finished listening to the audiobook, 10 audio CDs. Um, Starts out with the story of this man, Charles Carroll. He was one of the founding fathers of the United States. He's an Irish Catholic, signer of the Declaration of Independence. Declaration of Independence was mostly signed by, Protestants. Okay, they were the Puritans, and the Protestants were sort of the main founding fathers. Okay, the Catholics were in there, but not to that degree. Okay, the Catholics were actually greatly resented by the Protestants. Initially, the Protestants would call themselves Yankees or nativists, and they would call the Irish, popists or even St. Patrick's vermin. And here is a couple of Protestants saying, we don't want our schools corrupted by your Catholic version of the Bible. They wanted their Protestant King James version of the Bible. And the hostility of the Protestants to the Catholics was so bad that the Catholics had to make their own separate school system. It ended up being a very big deal. Here's a sense of the attitude of the Protestants, like Thomas Nast was the cartoonist for the Harper's Weekly newspaper. And here he shows the Catholic bishops coming on shore with their hats looking like alligators. And hide the children because they're going to be corrupted by Catholic ideas of religion. Okay. And this actually is a drawing of Tammany Hall, right here, Tammany Hall, where they've got one flag with the Irish harp and the other one with the Pope's hat, saying, the Irish are going to try to take over everything and ruin our schools, corrupt them with their Catholic influence. The Papists. Okay, and as you know, there were lots of signs going around in the 1800s. Help wanted, no Irish need apply. The Irish were very much second-class citizens in the 1700s and in the 1800s. They gradually started developing some type of clout and power in the second half of the 1800s. And nowadays, it's like this. It's not just no Irish apply. It's no white Caucasoid Christians apply, okay? That's where it's at. They're second-class citizens in this country. Think about it. Every single thing of affirmative action is against them. And it's not just them. It's a little bit other Asians and stuff too, but they're the main target of that. It's not to help anybody. It's to hurt them, okay? So we're not, that's not the focus of this talk, but that's a relevant point. Okay, so here then is another cartoon by Thomas Nast, and he's talking about the brutal behavior of the Irish, and they would portray the Irish like orangutans and then claim that they were violent. And this is making fun of how the Irish behaved, they claimed, on St. Patrick's Day in 1867. So that was a big thing. The Irish were poor, and they immigrated in massive numbers after the famine, from about 1844 to 1849. But as they immigrated more, they started to have a little more voting ability, so to speak. This is John Hughes, the real famous Bishop of New York. He was born in Ireland, but he became one of the most famous bishops of all time, and he was the Bishop of New York. And he did a lot of great things. He sort of personified that idea of the Fighting Irish. He got the parochial skills built. He got St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York started in 1858. He died around 1863, during the Civil War, and it was finished, about another 15 years later from that. He was the founder of Fordham College, originally called St. John's College. He did all kinds of good things, built lots of parochial schools, grade schools and high schools, built seminaries to train priests. He helped find orphanages, homeless shelters. All this stuff was done by the church. You don't need any public stuff. If you have the church functional, it does all this stuff, and it does it much better than public service organizations do. He found Magdalene shelters for prostitutes to turn their lives around. And Catholicism was really on the up and coming. Other names for the Irish, of course, the Paddies, Paddy Wagon was, locking up the Irish. The Crappie Boys, they had the hair cut short. The Mix is another word for Irish. The Fenians was their nationalist society to try to become free from the British in Ireland. And of course, they're called the Papists, and what they would say was called Popery. Another name for them was the Shamrock Truth Tellers, because they tell the truth pretty well. Sadly, the number of priests getting ordained in Boston's going down. In 1950, they'd ordained 50 priests a year. By the 1980s and 1990s, only about 10 priests per year. And a lot of people started sending their kids to public schools. Big mistake. Catholic kids are much better off in Catholic schools. I've been to both of them, public schools and Catholic schools. There's no comparison. Okay, here is St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, which was, ordained and initiated by that Bishop John Hughes we just saw in the last slide. And you can see, Catholic cathedrals, they're beautiful. Okay, they're beautiful. They're artistic masterpieces. They're the most beautiful buildings ever made in the history of the world, all right? And they were made by Catholics going back to, the 1200s, all right? The best ones are actually in France. But anyways, just to show what modernism does, atheistic Darwinism, modernism, they produce these, boring buildings that look like animal cages, and they always have a statue of turd in front. They're disgusting. Okay, here's another heroic Irish lady. This is an Irish nun named Sister Irene Fitzgibbon. She's founder of a foundling home where, abandoned children, orphans were placed, and she helped tons and tons of these kids to grow up and to have happy lives. She was a real famous heroine, okay? They had thousands of people attended her funeral. And like I said, if you let people alone, people want to do good things. They want to help other people. If you let the church grow and do its thing, it does all kinds of things. And it doesn't need any public service, okay? Public service things usually turn to crap. Oh, here was just a little timeline I was making when I was studying all this Irish history. And this is just sort of old school Irish history. Basically, the Celts arrived in Ireland about 700 BC. By 432 AD, that's when St. Patrick came, converted Ireland to Christianity. It was kind of easy to convert Ireland to Christianity. It's a long story when you go through Celtic history and religion. It's not as different as one would expect from Catholicism. And Catholicism is syncretic. It can absorb things and take the best of them and incorporate them into its own metaphysical philosophy of life. Okay, then Ireland started getting invaded more and more by the Vikings. Brian Boru, one of the great chieftains, fought off the Vikings. But then the Normans came just another 150 years later. And then Henry VIII, the evil king of England, declared himself king of Ireland. Henry VIII with 8 wives. There's the founder of Protestantism for you, a guy with 8 wives who got rid of about half of them. Okay, that's why I laugh when I hear the word Protestantism, in the same word as religion. Okay, but don't get me wrong. We have a lot in common with the Protestants. Okay, a lot of Protestants ended up doing some good things in the 1800s with regard to art. We'll talk about that a little later. Another big turning point was William of Orange won a pivotal battle at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, and that was basically a big victory of the Protestants over the Catholics. And after that, the Protestants had much more influence in Ireland, especially Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland basically became part of Britain, okay? And the Orange, William of Orange, so they were the Orange men, and that's why you got that orange stripe in the flag. The Catholics are the green stripe in the Irish flag, and the white is the hopeful unity of the both of them. And things were really bad for the Irish in the 1700s. There was the rebellion of Wolfe Tone. Wolfe Tones became a famous music group of Ireland with traditional music. And right around then, they imposed the penal laws. An Irishman really couldn't own anything, couldn't get an Irish education. It was pretty brutal. Emmet had another rebellion, and it didn't work so well. Then they made the United Kingdom of England, Wales, Ireland, and Scotland. Okay, in the 1800s, around 1830, Daniel O'Connell, did a pretty good job, and he was, like the savior of the liberator of Ireland. He got an end put to the penal laws. But then not much later, you had the famine, which was, especially from 1844 to 1849. 1845 in particular was a terrible year. They lost about 90% of the crops, and over 1 million Irish at that time emigrated to the United States. But their numbers went up in the United States, and they gained, more political powers and clout, so to speak, at that time in the United States. Over 1 million of them starved to death, and the Irish accentuated, there was a little bit of a food shortage, but they made it a famine. They wanted to get rid of the Irish in a big way. They would take their properties away, boot them out, and then turn their properties into cattle pastures instead of small family farms of potato growing. We talked about Bishop John Hughes. He became the bishop or the co-bishop really in 1837, and he was there until about 1863. Charles Stewart Parnell became real powerful and famous in the 1880s in Ireland, and he pushed real hard for the Home Rule. Land League was also pushing for more Irish citizen land ownership because that was sort of wealth back in those days. And Parnell was awesome. He did a great job as far as he could go, but it's a long story. He ended up, he married his mistress, but she had previously been married to another guy, Kitty O'Shea, and that sort of ruined his political climb, and it's sort of a sad story at that point. And so the Irish weren't able to establish Home Rule, even though Gladstone, the British Prime Minister, was trying to help them. And then there was attempts to revive the Irish language, especially the Gaelic League, brought a lot of real good culture to Ireland. And there were other, great persons of this time like William Butler Yeats and Lady Gregory, and getting more people to speak the Irish language, getting more people to attend plays and theater and to read. And then one of the biggest events in all the history of Ireland was the 1960 Easter Uprising in Dublin. And most of the leaders, except for De Valera, were executed. And the Irish people initially might have thought it was almost a little foolish, but after the brutal retaliation of the British, the entire country of Ireland was pissed off. And that led to the War of Anglo-Irish Independence, where they fought the British. And eventually there was a treaty in the early 1920s. And the deal was that, 26 of the 32 cities would be Catholic, all of Southern Ireland, if you will. And then the other 6 would stay in the north, and that would be Northern Ireland, okay? And Michael Collins was sent to negotiate with the British, while Edmund De Valera sort of stayed back. But it was a foregone conclusion, okay? Michael Collins knew that was the best they could do at that time. They didn't have the ability to go on, and he knew it was the best deal they could get. And he said, let's take this deal now, and things will get better. But De Valera was pissed off, and it started a civil war, Irish fighting Irish, and Michael Collins was killed. I wish Michael Collins had lived instead of De Valera. Okay, I thought he was better from my study of Irish history, but we don't need to get into that right now. Then the Irish, were sort of seen as, like I said, low-class secondary citizens of the United States. And one of the ways they proved themselves was by fighting very bravely in the Civil War. They actually fought, lots of them, hundreds of thousands of them, for both sides, for the Union Army and for the South. And this is the Irish flag right here. This is the Irish Brigade. And you can see it has a harp on it. And so you ask yourself, why did they have the harp on that? Well, for a couple of reasons. Number one, the Irish musicians transferred the history of Ireland to the younger people in stories and in songs. In addition, so they're really the guardians of history amongst the Irish population. In addition, the British were very brutal to them. And the British, like Queen Elizabeth in the 1600s, she forbid the Irish musicians to be allowed to play any music. She would have them executed. All the Irish musicians she could get her hands on would execute them, destroy their instruments. So the harp is a very strong, powerful symbol of freedom to the Irish. And this is just showing a rebel sons of Ireland, fighting on this side with their version. They've also got a harp on their flag, okay? So in some ways, it was brave. The fighting Irish proved how brave they were in battle, but they also proved how stupid they were, killing each other. And here it is, here you got the rebel Irish fighting the Northern Irish. Meanwhile, Ireland is being crushed by the British, and they're being enslaved in their home country, and they're all dying for some other country. Okay, here's the monument to the Irish who fought bravely at Gettysburg, and then this was just another picture of the Irish Brigade flag. They did fight really brave, man. It was amazing how many of them fought and died. Okay, this is one of the Irish generals, General Corcoran, Michael Corcoran. He was a brave, tough guy. Before the Civil War, Queen Victoria had come to visit New York, and he was ordered to parade his men in front of Queen Victoria. And he said, piss off, I'm not parading my men in front of the tyrant Queen of England. And he was put in jail for that. He eventually got pardoned. They needed his services to help out with the Civil War, but you got to love his attitude, okay? And then he was actually later caught. He fought up at the front. He was caught and imprisoned by the Southern, the Confederates. Eventually he was freed in a prison swap. He fought on, and he later was killed. But, there's a tough, brave Irishman. Okay, this is Corcoran with one of his Union soldiers, the 69th Regiment. Okay, and they even named the fort after him, Fort Corcoran. Okay, here's another real famous Irish general in the Civil War, and this is Thomas Maher. And there's quite a story that goes with Maher. He was a rebel against the British in Ireland, and he was actually imprisoned. He was sentenced to be executed, but he escaped, him along with McManus. And he was, it's a pretty famous story. He came to the United States, and then he was, a great general, real brave guy. Again, it's kind of sad, too, fighting against the other Irish on both sides. But there is a long story. There's a really good book about him. We won't get into it now, but he was another heroic guy in a big way. And eventually the Irish gained more power by the late 1800s in New York. And, you know, most of it was good. They were trying to help the poor Irish people coming in to be able to get jobs and get some education. There was, of course, was some corruption. And this is sort of the most famous of the corrupt bosses. This was Boss Tweed, famous for his shenanigans in Tammany Hall in New York. Okay. One thing, you know, when I talk about the Irish, they're really great at literature. They're really great at conversation. They're funny. They're brave. They're tough fighters. They're good workers. All that stuff. There's not that much art and painting from the Irish. Here's the most famous, best painting by an Irish painter of all time, Meeting on the Turret Stairs by Frederick Burton. It's voted the most popular Irish painting of all time. But there's other good ones too. You know, I studied Irish art to some extent, and there are a lot of other good painters too, but painting's not their thing. You know, they're so poor. When you're doing manual labor in the field, you know, for 14 hours a day, you don't got a lot of energy for painting. You got to have some luxury. You got to have some aristocracy to really have a lot of painters, you know, artistic painters of this type. Here's just a brief list of Irish writers, and there's tons of great Irish writers. St. Columba, of course, that was more of the monks. You know, that's all goes back to the book How the Irish Saved Civilization by Thomas Cahill, and they preserved all the Latin and Greek manuscripts and the Bible, and they made the Book of Kells, St. Columbus, Columbkill, and stuff like that. Okay, Jonathan Swift was a heroic guy too, and he really fought to try to help the Irish people. So I admired him, and gosh, was he clever and witty, Jonathan Swift. You know, he wrote Gulliver's Travels and a whole bunch of other things. A Tale of the Tub, that inspired me to have the title of one of my books. Two Tales in a Hot Tub. Okay, George Berkeley, the philosopher. Lawrence Stern, author of Tristram Shandy, a very clever book. You know, most of the book is what happened before he was born, so it's funny. It's a very funny, clever, witty, articulate book. Famous playwrights in England like Oliver Goldsmith and Richard Brinsley Sheridan, they were members of the club, you know, along with Samuel Johnson in England and London. Oscar Wilde, of course, was, you know, the genius playwright. Brilliant guy. He ended up being kind of debauched and alcoholic, abandoned his family, which pissed me off. So I was disappointed in him. I loved him when he was young and heroic, you know, comes from Ireland, and everybody hates his gut, and he becomes the best playwright in the whole city. Bram Stoker, Dracula, some of these other ones, you know, William Butler Yeats and Lady Gregory did a lot, you know, through the Gaelic League to try to increase learning about Irish language and history and literature. George Bernard Shaw, of course. James Joyce is hyped up as this great writer. I actually think James Joyce is quite overrated. He was kind of an alcoholic and a knucklehead, but I liked his portrait of the artist as a young man better than I liked Ulysses. I mean, I went through Ulysses backwards and forwards, and it's got its good parts. It's got some clever parody and stuff, but be that as it may, I really like C.S. Lewis a lot. Angela Ashes and McCourt's other books, they're okay. I think they're good. They're good, but they're not great. I really thought Oscar Wilde was great, for example, and C.S. Lewis was great. Okay, here's another painting by an Irish painter. This one by Edwin Austin Abbey. And there's another guy, McLeish. I actually meant to show McLeish's paintings of Hamlet. I kind of got his in there. I got those mixed up. Okay, anyways, Private View of the Royal Academy with Oscar Wilde. So Oscar Wilde, he pushed the movement of art for art's sake, which I actually think was kind of a step backwards. I mean, don't get me wrong, you sometimes need art for art's sake, but John Ruskin was his professor at Oxford, and so there was this competing ideas of what was to be art. So Oscar Wilde was from the school of art for art's sake, just because it's beautiful, versus the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was to go back to the religious intensity, the Middle Age, but with the modern skills of painting, and John Ruskin really supported them. I actually think the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was magnificent, you know, John Everett Millais and the other ones, and then their subsequent acolyte students like Edmund Leighton and a whole bunch of other ones. They're magnificent. That's some of the best art ever created in the history of the world. I'll call that the Victorian Renaissance. And it was really a combination of a Victorian Renaissance amongst Protestants, as well as something of what you might call a Catholic Renaissance in England, with Augustus Welby Pugin, the architect, with, you know, Cardinal Henry Newman, the Tractarian movement and all that. So we're not going to get into all that, but just letting you know that's a fascinating part of history. And then here's what you get with atheism. You get these jerks, putting a urinal into a museum. These modern art museums are an insult and a disgrace. But I just wanted to show you that. But because people sometimes say, well, how important is Christianity and Catholicism? It's very important because it gets the philosophy and the personal values and the attitude towards life squared away in the public's mind. So, to be nice, to be good, and to do good things. When you have atheism and Darwinism, and this modern Marxism type stuff, you end up with this. An art museum has statues of feces in it. Okay, that's an insult. That's a degradation of mankind. Okay, I just tell you this because I'm showing you the contrast between what's happening as the Irish are losing their values. This type of stuff's becoming bigger in society. This is where they took the crucifix of Christ and they dipped it in urine. This photographer guy, and he photographed it dipped in urine. That's called the piss Christ. And I don't blame somebody for smashing that. That's awful thing to do. Okay, and what I'm going to say here too is you need guys like this old Pope Julius. He was in Italy. He was the Pope around 1500. And here's a painting of him by Raphael in 1512. He basically was a tough old bastard, and he, got on a horse and he fought, the French when they were trying to come into Italy. He commissioned the great artists like Raphael and Michelangelo to make the beautiful artworks in the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, Raphael's School of Athens and whatnot. And what I'm trying to say is you need these old guys. People say, oh, he was a corrupt pope, he had a girlfriend and he had children and he had syphilis. Yeah, fine. He was a tough, smart old guy who did wonderful things, who made the Vatican like the most beautiful art museum in the whole history of the world, okay? So you need those tough old guys. And I think you definitely, if you're going to fix the Catholic Church, you got to let guys get married. You get much better men in there. I mean, anyways, the Catholic Church right now stinks. It's corrupt. It's all messed up. The modern pope's like the Antichrist piece of crap, okay? Okay, so anyways, here's Michael Collins, a leader of one faction that accepted the treaty in the 1920s for, peace with Ireland, peace with Britain as far as they could get it. Okay, and here's Eamon de Valera, and he's the guy who, in my opinion, stabbed Michael Collins in the back, and so I don't like him. Okay, Michael Collins is a heroic guy to help Ireland. Here's, Michael Collins at his wake. He's got the Irish flag on him again. Orange for the Orangemen Protestants, white for the hopeful unity between the Protestants and the Catholics, and green for the Catholics. So there's Michael Collins, for the love of Ireland. Okay. Okay, now here's a Catholic school, and they had to build Catholic schools because the Protestants were like a million times worse behaved towards the Catholics than the other way around. And I went to public school for a little while during my childhood. Then I went to public school. Then I went to Catholic school for a while. The big difference was that Catholic school, the nuns were in charge. Now, don't get me wrong. The nuns were, I would say, about the same as the public school teachers. They didn't know that much, okay? And, I would sit around in class and I was pretty bored. Okay, but the difference was all the kids are dressed nice in their uniforms. They're all well behaved. In the public schools, there's smoking and drinking. MJ, there's kids having sex, kids getting pregnant, kids ditching school, flunking out. Lots of kids from public schools end up with their lives entirely messed up. They end up being drug addicts. They don't do well. Okay, versus in the Catholic school, there's not a single person using drugs. Not one. No one was having sex in 7th or 8th grade. Okay, kids were having, fooling around by 6th grade in the public schools. All right, there was nobody doing drugs. Nobody's having sex. I would know. I knew all the kids. I played on the sports teams. I knew all the kids. The adults were in charge. As simple a thing as standing in line waiting to walk in a room. I remember as a joke, I tripped a friend of mine in line, and some male teacher at the Catholic school shoved me up against the wall, and I was so kind of like shocked by that because that would never in a million years happen at a public school. But, I was misbehaving, but it was a startling difference between the two schools, okay? And everybody was on the side of the teacher, and my parents would be on the side of the teacher. Why'd you trip the other kid? You're a jerk, okay? You deserve to get shoved against the wall. That was the philosophy of the Catholic schools. As far as their academics, they just gave me a book. They go, we don't teach mathematics at your level. Here's a book. Do some problems on your own. I go, okay, thanks you. That's helpful. Okay, and here's, Catholicism. What is it all about? It's all about celebration of the family and love thy neighbor, love thy family, be fruitful and multiply, be good to each other. Okay, it's the opposite of this modern liberalism, atheistic Darwinism that wants, depopulation, okay? Wants to, decrease the size of the population, It wants you to, abort your baby. Okay, it doesn't want you to have kids. It doesn't want you to be healthy and fruitful and multiply. Okay, you want to see happiness? Here's a picture of happiness. Okay, I'll take myself off the picture. I mean, this is one of the greatest movies of all time. It's a Wonderful Life. Jimmy Stewart, by the way, was Irish. All right, it's just beautiful. The happiness of the family being together. It's not about money. It's about being together and trying to help each other and be happy. Okay, it's beautiful. I love this movie. It's one of the all-time greatest movies of all time. It's a Wonderful Life. Okay, and the Irish church was the center of the community, okay? The parochial school and the Irish church was the center of the community. They don't need anything public. They don't need anything public. I mean, it had sporting events, it had social events on the weekend, it had mass on the weekend. I remember I would try to get dressed nice because I liked this girl and I'd hope I'd see her at church, okay? She didn't like me, but nice Irish girl. But anyways, church was where it was at. That was where you see all the kids, your friends. All right. And then, this big sporting event on the weekend, whatever it was, a football game, a basketball game or something, or whatever the event was. It was nice. And we were friends. There might be some kid, you got a rivalry who's going to be the starter on the sports team, but it was good. I remember those people fondly, and they're nice people. And then also there was a heroic sense of the church in just the community. Here's the Bells of St. Mary's, a very nice movie about with Bing Crosby as the priest, the father of the school, and Ingrid Bergman as the lady head nun. And it's a beautiful story. It's a very nice movie. You want to watch a nice movie with your family? Watch The Bells of St. Mary's, okay? And then there was also, here's Boys Town, Father Flanagan, Spencer Tracy, okay? This Irish Catholic priest was a hero in society, and that's a good thing. Okay, here's Archbishop Spellman of New York. He was like really famous national figure. Here he is going to Italy in World War II and giving communion to the troops in 1944. Okay, and that's sort of just another example of the bravery and the status of the church at that time. Here's another real famous Irish Catholic priest in America, Fulton Sheen. He's on the TV. He's giving radio shows. Okay, here's just another movie, an example of the heroism of the priests as they're celebrated in Hollywood. This is from the movie On the Waterfront, where, with Marlon Brando, the one where he says, I could have been a contender. Okay, and this is called the Sermon on the Dock scene, when this Irish Catholic priest, Carl Malden is the name and the real name of the actor, gave a heroic speech at the docks where there were corrupt gangs, and he was trying to give a speech, talking to the men about, being good and doing the right thing. And this stuff on his shirt, they're throwing stuff at him. They're throwing food and scraps and junk at him. Anyways, I'm just showing you this. The Irish Catholic priest was a hero in society, a man who stands up and does the right thing even though it's not popular, and he puts himself at risk to do so. And so that was the morality of the country and of Hollywood at that time. And obviously it's changed quite a lot. Could you imagine an Irish Catholic priest being the hero of a movie in modern Hollywood? Okay, here's another heroic individual, Senator Joseph McCarthy. Here he is when he was a United States Marine. Okay, heroic guy, and he pointed out the fact there was a problem with communism taking over the Democratic Party, which is very true. And of course, because he told the truth, he got vilified and sort of run out of his power. But he told the truth, and it was a problem in the United States, and it's a bigger problem nowadays. Okay, here's another part of the fall of the Irish. Margaret Sanger. She was of Irish descent. She was a big promoter of birth control and abortion. Well, a lot of Irish kind of lashed onto that, and guess what? The more they lash onto that, the smaller their population is, and the less influence they have in society. And there's more to it than that. But man, I have some Irish friends, telling me how great birth control pill was. I will go, oh yeah, it's a great way to help the Irish people grow extinct. All these women think, oh, having a job is so great. You know why you have a job? Because you're poor, okay? When I was a kid growing up, 1960s and 1970s, most of the women did not have jobs. They stayed at home, and you know what? They were a lot happier than the women nowadays. What's so great about having a job? Somebody goes and bosses you around, pays you less than you deserve, and you do it because you need the money. You trade your time for money, okay? Wouldn't it be nice if your husband was making a lot of money? You could just stay home, take care of your family, spend more time with your kids who really need you, to whom you're the most important person in the world, and do what you want in your free time. My mom stayed home. She had the greatest life of like anybody I've ever seen in my life. She played tennis because she liked playing tennis. She was on the board of directors of an orphanage because she wanted to help kids. She was a minister of care in the church because she enjoyed doing that. Okay, she was a tour guide at the Art Institute because she enjoyed that. She was a tour guide at an architectural museum because she enjoyed that. Okay, and then she did all kinds of social things for the family and to help friends and stuff. She had an awesome life where she did what she wanted and she was always helping people. Now, would you rather be a secretary in some place, making minimum wage compared to being like my mother? Are you kidding me? My mother was the greatest woman I ever saw in my life, okay? And my father working and paying the bills so she didn't have to, and the economy was so great in those days, it was easy to be wealthy, okay? All my friends' mom, they weren't pretty ladies who lucked out, trophy wives to some rich guy. They were all just average looking. I never, out of all my whole life as a child, I knew tons of people through all the sports teams I played on. Only one guy had an attractive mom, and that was because her father was divorced and married a young trophy wife, and he was a rich owner of a company. That was the only mom I can remember out of the tons and tons of friends I had and visited as a kid that I thought was even kind of pretty, okay? And she was even kind of old, okay? So what I'm trying to say is, it wasn't like these are pretty women. All the women were wealthy. You just get married to some guy. Everybody had a nice house. Okay, back in the old days, Richard Daley was the mayor of Chicago. And he was called the boss. Mike Royko was this newspaper columnist who would write sort of satire, kind of funny at times. And Daley was, an old Irish guy, okay? And he sort of ran the city of Chicago. And later on, his son, also named Richard Daley, different middle initial, I think, ran the city for a long time as well. But the Irish have long since been sort of pushed out of Chicago. Okay, here is a timeline of Boston history. Probably, up until the early 2000s, Massachusetts was like the most Irish state with 25% of the people having Irish ancestry. And usually if people have a combined ancestry, they used to want to claim Irish because they were sort of proud to be Irish. And the Irish were seen as being kind of popular in the past. St. Patrick's Day was a big holiday of the year. But nowadays, the Irish are one of the most hated minority groups in the whole United States. I mean, they're targeted for removal from the United States, okay? And they're so stupid they don't even realize it. I think where the Irish fell apart was when they started thinking they were Americans instead of remembering that they're Irish, because it was the Catholic Church that held them together, the Catholic Church and the Catholic schools that held them together. Once they let go of that, they sort of, became stupid, almost like atheistic type culture. Birth control pills, tiny families or no kids, and they just fade into oblivion. Okay, so some of the famous stuff in Boston was, of course, like the Irish guy mayor for many, many years was this James Michael Curley. Okay, and then, of course, John F. Kennedy. And there's other stuff here, but that's not our focus right now. This book went through all this stuff. And again, with atheistic Darwinism, instead of having a church as the center of the community, they just burned down all the churches. Stalin burned down 48,000 churches in Russia, okay? That is the goal of communism, okay? To get rid of all the churches and get rid of all Christianity, because it says all men are equal before the eyes of God, so a tyrant can't push them around so easily. John F. Kennedy was probably like the high point of Catholicism in the United States, because it suggested that, hey, even if you're a Catholic, previously, excluded, beaten from the public schools, a low-rate second-class citizen, now, you're in the Oval Office. And he was a beloved president by almost all of the country, but the communist faction, bumped him off and got rid of him, and the Catholics and the Christians in the United States have been going downhill ever since. Okay, now there was a little brief uptick in coming out of Ronald Reagan. And, let me tell you something. Ronald Reagan was a heroic guy, okay? He was a heroic actor. He was a heroic anti-communist in the 1950s and the 1960s. He knows the truth about that, okay? And he was a great president. People try to criticize, Ronald Reagan, he's so stupid. He got Alzheimer's after he took a slug and he bled out and was hypotensive. That damaged his brain. That's true, okay? But I can tell you something. I was in California at Stanford in the early 1970s. Man, was California rich. A lot of the colleges didn't even charge tuition. You could go to college for free because California was so rich, okay? Look at California now. It's a crap hole, okay? We used to walk around in San Francisco and just be happy to be out there, go to museums, go to the zoo. It was it was a safe place, nice enough to walk around like that. Of course, I didn't spend much time in San Francisco, but what I'm trying to say is you could go. It'd be unthinkable to visit San Francisco nowadays. It's such a, a crime scene, okay? But Ronald Reagan made California rich, okay? I knew a bunch of, all the adult men, my dad and all his friends. They loved the fact that Reagan was president because they were all super wealthy. My dad made like 3 times as much as doctors make nowadays. More than that, 4 times as much, okay? Doctors got paid a lot of money, and the country was rich, okay? All the people I know, they all had their houses paid off, their mortgages paid off in full, okay? Like I said, all the wives stayed home because the country was so rich. All the kids, as soon as they turned 16-year-old for their birthday, they got a new automobile car as a present from their parents. That was routine. I'm not talking about wealthy people. I'm talking about lower middle class. That was routine when I was a kid. Now America's so poor, people can't even afford to go to college. Okay, so here's where it's at. This is where Christianity's at nowadays. The decision has been made by Democrats to get rid of the Christians in this country. Okay, it's going to start out with the Caucasoid ones first because they're seen as the biggest problem, the biggest obstacle to imposing, complete control over them. Okay, so here's their hope: rally to the cross, help each other, and you can still maintain freedom in society, free speech, and free other things, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But if you think the dogs are going to protect you, dogs can't do much. You either rally to the cross or you're screwed. And I realize most people are far too stupid and ignorant to realize this, but study history and you'll see. What I'm saying is obvious. It's in writing. Anybody who studied history and is honest knows this, okay? The sad thing is most people haven't studied history. And if you haven't studied, what happened in the 1900s, then you don't know this. If you didn't study what happened in Rome, after the fall, during the fall of the Roman Empire, then you don't know the stuff. If you didn't study what happened in the Italian Renaissance, you don't know the stuff. If you haven't studied just a little bit about the Irish and their conflict with the British, then you don't quite understand how it works. But anyways, this is your hope. This is the last chance for the Irish before they head into extinction. They're being headed into extinction in their own country. The elites have opened up their borders and are allowing massive immigration from other countries that are hostile to the traditions of the Irish. And if anybody complains, they'll say, oh, you're racist, okay, which is BS, okay? Every country deserves to have an intact border and deserves to have control of immigration so that if there's enough jobs for the visitors and they serve a useful role in your society rather than just being there as competition or even worse, for intentional destruction of the society. So anyways, hopefully Ireland will recapture some of its freedom. Hopefully freedom and Christianity will continue in America. So I think that's the last slide. We'll see. Yeah, that's it. So anyways, I thought the book was quite good. 10 audio CDs. I enjoyed listening to it. There's a lot of pictures in the book too, many of which I showed in this video here today. So hope that was interesting.